When they were done, they left her lying lifeless on the floor, blood pooling around her.
Let this be a lesson.
One of the men spat as they walked out.
No one crosses us.
Ruby barked and clawed at the cage. Ruby stayed near the front door, waiting for her master to return. But Aeesha didn't come back. The apartment felt cold, empty. Every sound, every creak of the floorboards reminded Ruby of the night those men broke in and took her master away. And now, she's heartbroken. Ruby's instincts sharpened into something darker, something vengeful. Aeesha sat by the window of her small Delhi apartment, staring out at the distant lights flickering across the city skyline. The hum of traffic from the streets below barely reached her quiet neighborhood on the outskirts, but it was enough to remind her that the world outside never truly slept. It was just past midnight, and most of her neighbors had long since turned off their lights, retreating into the safety of their homes. Yet for Aeesha, this was when her work began. She sipped from a steaming cup of tea, her thoughts far away. Her German shepherd, Ruby, lay curled at her feet, her soft brown eyes following every move her master made. The bond between them was deeper than words could explain. Ruby had been with Aeesha for 4 years, ever since she had adopted the puppy as a gift to herself after landing her first major job at a local news station. From the start, Ruby had been more than just a pet. She was Aeesha's confidant, protector, and, in recent months, an unlikely partner in her dangerous work. Aeesha set the cup down on the table and opened her laptop. Her fingers hovered over the keys, hesitant, as if she could feel the weight of the story she was about to write. For months, she had been working undercover, investigating a human trafficking ring that lured young girls from rural villages into the sprawling city of Delhi. These girls, many of them barely teenagers, were promised good jobs and opportunities, only to be trapped in a life of forced prostitution. It had taken Aeesha weeks of painstaking effort to gather the information she needed. She had posed as a curious young woman in markets and shady bars, blending into the background, listening to whispers and rumors. She had interviewed survivors, former victims who had managed to escape the clutches of the traffickers. Some of them were too scared to talk, still haunted by their past, but others had been braver, sharing their stories in hushed tones, their faces lined with fear and pain. The trafficking ring was larger than Aeesha had initially imagined. It wasn't just local thugs running girls from one corner of Delhi to another. This was an organized operation, with connections stretching far beyond the city. Some of the girls were shipped off to other countries, while others were forced to work in brothels, right under the noses of those who claimed to be protecting the city's people. Over the past few months, Ruby had been Aisha's constant companion on her nighttime stakeouts. Together, they had watched and waited, gathering evidence to expose the trafficking ring. Aeesha would take notes, snapping discreet pictures, while Ruby kept a vigilant watch, alert to any signs of danger. But tonight, as Aeesha prepared to type the first few lines of her article, she felt an unusual heaviness. Something was gnawing at her, a feeling she couldn't quite shake. She leaned back in her chair, looking out at the quiet street below. It seemed peaceful, but peace could be deceiving. Delhi was a city of contradictions, beauty and chaos, light and darkness, safety and danger, all existing side by side. Her thoughts wandered to the girls she had met during her investigation. Young faces, some no older than 16, their eyes hollow from the horrors they had seen. Some of them had been snatched from their families, taken without warning, while others had been tricked into coming to the city with promises of a better life. Aeesha had met one girl, Annika, who had been trafficked when she was only 14. Her voice still echoed in Aisha's mind.
They told me I would work as a maid.
Annika had said, her eyes downcast, hands nervously clutching the edge of her tattered dress.
But when I got to Delhi, they took my phone, locked me in a room, and they made me do things. I couldn't escape.
Aeesha had listened, her heart breaking as the girl recounted her ordeal. Stories like Annika's were all too common, and yet every time Aeesha heard one, it only strengthened her resolve to bring these men to justice. Someone had to expose them. Someone had to fight for the girls who couldn't fight for themselves, but she knew the risks. She'd heard the warnings from colleagues, from friends who worked in the same circles. Investigating human trafficking was dangerous, especially when the traffickers had connections to powerful people. Aeesha had been careful, but she knew she couldn't remain invisible forever. Still, the pull of the story was too strong. She had uncovered too much to back down now. The thought of those girls, the ones she could still save, was what kept her going, even when fear crept into the edges of her mind. Aeesha took a deep breath and began typing. Her words flowed easily at first, laying out the facts she had gathered, weaving in the stories of the victims she had met. But as the clock ticked past 2 in the morning, her focus began to wane. She stretched and stood up, moving toward the window to take a break. Ruby followed her, standing by her side and resting her head on Aeesha's leg.
You're always by my side, aren't you, Ruby?
Aeesha whispered, stroking the dog's head.
I don't know what I'd do without you.
Ruby's ears perked up, as if in agreement. Aeesha smiled, grateful for her loyal companion. The night was still, the air cool and crisp. Everything seemed calm, but Ruby's sharp eyes darted to the street below. She stiffened slightly, her body tense.
What is it?
Aeesha noticed the change in her dog's posture. She asked softly, looking out the window. Ruby let out a low growl, her eyes focused on a dark figure lingering near the end of the street. Aeesha's heart skipped a beat. At first, she thought it was just her imagination. Delhi was full of people wandering at all hours of the night. But something about this person's movements seemed off. They weren't walking like a passerby. They were standing still, as if watching. Aeesha's breath caught in her throat. She knew she was being paranoid, but after months of living on the edge, suspicion had become second nature to her. She moved away from the window, her heart racing slightly.
It's probably nothing,
She whispered to Ruby,
just someone passing through.
though her words were more for herself than for the dog. Aeesha forced herself to step back. She couldn't let fear control her. Not now. She had a job to finish, and her article was almost complete. She would submit it to her editor tomorrow, and by the end of the week, it would be published. The traffickers would be exposed, and the authorities would be forced to act. She had come too far to let a shadow outside her window stop her. With a determined sigh, Aeesha returned to her desk, pushing the unsettling thoughts aside. Ruby stayed by her feet, still alert, her eyes flicking toward the window now and then. The feeling of being watched lingered, but Aeesha buried herself in her work, hoping that by the time she finished, it would all just be a bad memory. Little did she know, the shadow outside her window was just the beginning. The next few days passed in a blur. Aeesha threw herself into her work, meeting with her sources, checking her facts, and putting the finishing touches on her article. She had uncovered more information about the trafficking ring than she had initially thought possible. The web of criminals extended far beyond Delhi, reaching into other cities and even across borders. It was a network so vast and insidious that exposing it felt like an overwhelming task. But Aeesha was determined. This wasn't just another assignment. This was personal. She remembered her younger sister, Shriti, who had disappeared 6 years ago, vanishing without a trace from their small village. No one knew what had happened to her, and the police had done little to help. At the time, Aeesha had been too young to understand the complexities of such cases. But as she grew older, she realized that her sister's disappearance was likely linked to the same kind of trafficking she was now investigating. Shriti's memory haunted Aeesha every day. Though she never spoke about it openly, the loss of her sister was the driving force behind her career choice. It was why she had decided to become a journalist in the first place. It was why she had dedicated her life to seeking out the truth, no matter how dangerous it was. Now, as she worked on her final draft, her thoughts kept drifting back to Shriti. What if her sister had fallen into the same trap? What if she had been taken by the same men who were now running girls through Delhi? The thought made her blood run cold, but it also gave her the strength to push forward. She would finish this story, for the girls still out there, and for Shriti, wherever she was. The nights grew longer, and Aeesha barely slept. The looming deadline of her investigation's publication was both a beacon of hope and a source of anxiety. She knew the traffickers would retaliate once the story broke, but the thought of their reaction was something she tried to push aside. Still, The nagging feeling of being watched lingered, growing stronger each day. One night, as she sat hunched over her desk, her phone buzzed. It was a message from her editor, Mr. Ishan. Ishan, how's the piece coming along? We'll need the final draft by Friday morning. Aeesha stared at the message, her heart pounding. It was Tuesday night. She had only 2 days left to make sure everything was perfect. After this, there would be no turning back. Aeesha, almost done. You'll have it in time. She hit send, her fingers trembling slightly. She glanced at Ruby, who was curled up at the foot of the bed, her eyes wide open. The dog hadn't been sleeping much lately either, and Aeesha wondered if Ruby was picking up on her own growing unease. But there was no time for hesitation. She had to push through. She opened her notes, scrolling through the interviews and reports she had gathered. Each girl's story was more heartbreaking than the last, but each one also fueled her determination. She was their voice now, and she couldn't fail them. The hours ticked by as Aeesha worked late into the night, her fingers flying across the keyboard. She felt the weight of her investigation like a storm brewing overhead, but Ruby's quiet presence at her feet kept her grounded. Suddenly, Ruby's ears perked up. She stood quickly, her body tense, and let out a low growl. Aeesha looked up from her screen, startled by the change in Ruby's demeanor.
What is it, girl?
She whispered, her heart skipping a beat. Ruby moved toward the window, her growl growing louder. Aeesha followed, cautiously pulling back the curtain. Her eyes scanned the street below, and once again she saw a dark figure standing at the far end of the street, partially hidden by a tree. The figure wasn't moving, just standing there, watching. Aeesha's heart raced. This wasn't the first time she had seen someone lingering near her apartment late at night. The fear she had tried so hard to suppress began to rise again, but she forced herself to stay calm.
It's just a coincidence.
She murmured to herself,
Maybe it's someone from the neighborhood.
but Ruby's instincts told a different story. The dog continued to growl, her body poised to attack, as if she knew the figure outside was a threat. Aeesha stepped away from the window, pulling the curtain closed. She couldn't afford to let fear control her now. She had work to finish, and nothing could stand in the way of her completing the article. But even as she sat back at her desk, the uneasy feeling wouldn't leave her. She couldn't shake the thought that the traffickers had found out about her. What if they had been watching her all along? What if they knew where she lived? Shaking off the thought, she continued typing. She had to finish. She had to keep going. The next morning, Aeesha woke to the sound of Ruby barking. The noise startled her awake, her heart racing as she blinked at the morning light streaming through the window. Ruby stood at the door, growling and barking as if something, or someone, was on the other side. Aeesha sat up quickly, her pulse pounding in her ears. She rushed to the door and peered through the peephole. The hallway was empty, but Ruby wouldn't stop barking.
What's going on, girl?
Aeesha muttered, unlocking the door and stepping into the hallway. She saw nothing, just the quiet of her apartment building, the sun barely rising over the horizon. But Ruby's barking didn't cease. She sniffed the air, her ears twitching as she scanned the empty space, looking for a sign of danger. Aeesha glanced at her phone. It was still early, but she decided to head to the newsroom, hoping the safety of the bustling office would ease her nerves. She quickly packed her things, but as she did, Ruby remained restless, pacing back and forth near the door.
Let's go, Ruby. We'll feel safer in the city.
Aeesha said, fastening the dog's leash. They headed out together, Ruby at her side, and took a taxi into the heart of Delhi. As they rode through the busy streets, Aeesha's mind raced. She knew she couldn't afford to lose focus now. She was so close to finishing the investigation, so close to exposing the trafficking ring. When they arrived at the newsroom, Aeesha was greeted by the familiar hustle and bustle of reporters typing away at their desks, phones ringing constantly. But even in the crowded office, the feeling of being watched clung to her like a shadow. Ruby stayed by her feet as Aeesha sat at her desk, continuing to work on the article. She had only a few more sections to finalize before submitting it to Ishan. Each sentence had to be precise, each detail backed by evidence. There could be no mistakes. By the time evening rolled around, Aeesha had finished her draft. She stared at the screen for a long time, her eyes scanning the final version. It was ready. This was the story that could change everything. With a deep breath, she hit send, feeling both a sense of accomplishment and a rising wave of anxiety. Now, all she could do was wait. That night, back at her apartment, Aeesha tried to relax. She poured herself a cup of tea and sat by the window, looking out at the quiet street. Ruby lay by her feet, seemingly calm, but Aeesha could sense the dog's unease. She thought about the article she had submitted earlier. It was out of her hands now, and soon the traffickers would know she had exposed them. She tried to push the thought away, but it lingered like a dark cloud. Suddenly, Ruby's ears perked up again. She stood abruptly, growling at the door. Aeesha froze, her heart hammering in her chest.
Not again, Ruby. You're going to give me a heart attack. Now it's time to go to bed,
Aeesha said as she led Ruby to her cage and locked it from the outside. Just to be sure all was well before finally going to bed, Aeesha went to the door and peered through the peephole. This time, she saw movement. A shadowy figure standing just outside her apartment. Before she could react, the door was kicked in with a violent crash, sending her stumbling back. 3 men stormed in, their faces twisted in anger.
So you think you can expose us, you little brat?
One of the men snarled, grabbing Aeesha by the hair and slamming her into the floor. The others circled around her, their voices dripping with malice. Aeesha struggled, but they were too strong. One of them slapped her across the face, hard enough to make her vision blur.
We warned you. Now you're going to pay.
The man growled. As they beat her, Ruby barked and snarled, clawing at the cage Aeesha had locked her in earlier. The dog's howls of fury filled the apartment, but she was trapped, unable to protect her master. The men took turns, sexually assaulting Aeesha violently until she could barely move. Her cries for help went unanswered, drowned out by the sound of Ruby's desperate barking. When they were done, they left her lying lifeless on the floor, blood pooling around her.
Let this be a lesson.
One of the men spat as they walked out.
No one crosses us.
Ruby barked and clawed at the cage, until finally, hours later, Aeesha's neighbours, drawn by the noise, broke into the apartment. They found her lying in a pool of her own blood, barely alive, with Ruby still barking frantically. The neighbours freed Ruby, and the dog rushed to Aeesha's side, licking her face and whining, trying desperately to wake her. But Aeesha didn't stir. Ruby paced around Aeesha's motionless body, her whimpers softening to mournful cries. The neighbours, shocked by the scene, immediately called for an ambulance. As they waited, Ruby nudged her master gently with her nose, hoping, praying for a sign of life. But Aeesha remained still, her breath shallow, her face battered and bruised. The next few hours were a blur. Paramedics arrived and rushed Aeesha to the hospital, but Ruby wasn't allowed to follow. She was left behind, staring helplessly as the ambulance pulled away, its sirens echoing in the early morning light. Days passed in silence. Ruby stayed near the front door, waiting for her master to return. But Aeesha didn't come back. The apartment felt cold, empty. Every sound, every creak of the floorboards reminded Ruby of the night those men broke in and took her master away. And now, she's heartbroken. Ruby's instincts sharpened into something darker, something vengeful. 3 days after the attack, Aeesha's fate was finally sealed. She had slipped into a coma and died from her injuries in the hospital. Ruby had sensed the change. When the neighbours returned to tell her that Aeesha was gone, Ruby howled in agony, her heart shattered into pieces. But within the depths of her sorrow, something else took root. The desire for justice, for revenge. Ruby remembered the men who had hurt her master. She'd seen their faces, smelled their scent. She could never forget them. The next day, as if driven by an unseen force, Ruby slipped out of the apartment. She'd been trained to follow Aeesha's commands, to stay close, but her instincts were too strong now. She had a mission, one that went beyond the loyalty of a companion. She was going to find the men who had taken Aeesha from her. The streets of Delhi bustled with life, but to Ruby, it was all a blur. She moved through the crowds with precision, her nose to the ground, her mind focused on one thing, tracking the scent of those men. It was faint, but familiar. She'd caught a whiff of it during her countless nights spent with Aeesha, watching the hideouts of the traffickers. Ruby knew where they lingered, where they met, and where they hid. She followed the trail through the winding streets, past the market stalls, and into the darker, seedier parts of the city. Her keen senses guided her through the labyrinth of alleyways, her sharp eyes scanning every corner, every shadow. Hours passed, but Ruby didn't stop. Her determination was unwavering. Then she found it, the spot where she and Aeesha had often observed the traffickers. It was a dilapidated building on the edge of town, one that was always teeming with suspicious activity. From her hiding spot behind a cluster of crates, Ruby could see a man standing outside smoking a cigarette. It was him, one of the men from that night. Ruby's muscles tensed, her heart pounding in her chest. The man had no idea she was there, watching him, planning her next move. As he flicked the cigarette butt to the ground and turned to walk away, Ruby sprang into action. She darted out from the shadows, her paws silent against the pavement as she stalked her prey. The man walked casually down a deserted street, oblivious to the danger following him. But when Ruby was close enough, she made her move. With a swift leap, she lunged at the man, sinking her teeth into his leg. The man screamed in agony, stumbling as Ruby's powerful jaws clamped down harder. He tried to shake her off, but Ruby's grip was relentless. She remembered the way he had laughed as Aeesha lay bleeding on the floor. Now it was Ruby's turn to make him pay. She dragged the man to the ground, her growls deep and furious. She bit down on his arm next, tearing into his flesh with precision. The man flailed, his screams echoing through the empty streets, but no one came to help. Ruby didn't stop until the man lay motionless beneath her. Only then did she release her grip, panting as she stood over him, her eyes burning with rage. She had avenged Aeesha, at least one of them, but her mission wasn't over. There were still two more. The next day, Ruby returned to the streets. She knew she couldn't stop now, not until every man who had hurt her master was brought to justice. Her next target was easy to find. The second man had a distinct scent, one Ruby had caught many times when he'd passed through the same neighborhood as the traffickers. She followed the trail through the busy streets, her mind focused on the hunt. By afternoon, Ruby had tracked him to a small, run-down apartment building near the outskirts of the city. She waited patiently outside, hidden behind a wall, watching as the man exited the building, unaware of the danger lurking just a few feet away. This time, Ruby didn't wait for him to make the first move. As soon as he stepped into the alleyway, she leapt out, her fangs bared and ready. The man barely had time to react before Ruby was on him, her teeth sinking into his neck. He screamed, trying to throw her off, but Ruby's strength was unmatched. She tore into his throat, blood spilling onto the pavement as the man's life drained away. Ruby stood over him, panting, her eyes wild. She had avenged her master again, but there was still one more. The third man was more elusive. Ruby searched for days, tracking his scent through the streets, but he was always one step ahead, always slipping away before she could catch him. Frustration built within her, but she didn't give up. She couldn't give up, not until she had finished what she started. Finally, after almost a week of searching, Ruby found him. He was holed up in an old warehouse on the edge of town, surrounded by other members of the trafficking ring. It was a dangerous place, but Ruby didn't hesitate. Under the cover of darkness, she crept into the warehouse, her movements silent and calculated. She had no plan other than to find the man and end it once and for all. Inside the warehouse, the air was thick with the smell of sweat and fear. Ruby moved swiftly, her senses sharp, and then she saw him. The last man who had been in Aeesha's apartment that night. He was sitting with a group of other men, laughing and drinking, oblivious to the danger lurking just a few feet away. Ruby didn't wait. She lunged at him, her powerful jaws clamping down on his arm. The man screamed, and the others jumped up in shock, but Ruby's focus was unbreakable. She tore into his flesh, her teeth ripping through skin and bone. The other men tried to intervene, but Ruby was too fast. She dodged their attempts to pull her away, her growls filling the air as she bit down harder. By the time the man stopped moving, Ruby stood victorious. The others scattered, terrified by the sight of the bloodied dogs standing over their fallen comrade. Ruby had done it. She had avenged her master. 2 days later, Ruby found her way back to Aeesha's grave. It was a quiet spot in the cemetery, marked with a simple headstone that read, Aeesha Mahendra, beloved daughter, sister, and friend. Ruby lay down beside the grave, her body tired, her heart heavy. She had done what she set out to do. She had avenged her master's death, but now, with the men responsible for Aeesha's suffering gone, the weight of her loss came crashing down. For hours, Ruby stayed by Aeesha's grave, whimpering softly, her heart breaking all over again. The bond between them had been more than just one of loyalty. It had been a connection of love, trust, and understanding. And now, without Aeesha, Ruby felt lost. As the sun began to set, Ruby's whimpers faded to silence. She lay still, her head resting on the cold earth above her master's body. And for the first time in days, she allowed herself to grieve. The city moved on without them, but Ruby's world would never be the same. Aeesha was gone, and no amount of vengeance could change that. But Ruby had fulfilled her promise. She had protected her master, even when it was too late. And now, at Aeesha's grave, Ruby finally allowed herself to rest. The story of Aeesha Mahendra's death spread throughout Delhi, and her investigation into the human trafficking ring sparked an outcry. Authorities launched a full investigation, uncovering more layers of the criminal organization and bringing many more to justice. But no one knew the full story of how Aeesha's loyal companion had exacted her own form of justice. One bite at a time, Ruby remained a quiet legend in the neighborhood, a symbol of loyalty, love, and the unbreakable bond between a master and her dog. In the end, Ruby had been more than just a protector. She had been Aeesha's avenger, and so Ruby stayed at cemetery, day after day, guarding the grave of the only person she had ever truly loved. If you enjoyed this story, please support us by liking this video and subscribing to our channel. Thank you for watching, and see you in our next story.